Hello. Um, I don't have note cards, so I just put them on like cut pieces of paper. Hopefully that's okay. Yeah. Many people know of the famous actor Robert Downey Jr. for his famous roles in movies like the Iron Man series, the Avengers series, and TV shows like The Sherlock Holmes. But few people know of the tragedy surrounding his past life. Did you know that, according to NikkiSwift.com, Robert Downey Jr. was controlled by drug addiction in his early years of his career? Did you know that Robert Downey Jr.'s parents were heavy alcoholics and drug addicts? Did you know that, although drugs and alcohol made up a large part of Robert Downey Jr.'s life, he was able to get out of it and make the most of his life? Although many of us here are familiar with this famous actor, not many people actually know his story. And that is why I'd like to tell you about Robert Downey Jr., shown right here. Robert Downey Jr. once said, "The lesson is that you can make mistakes and be forgiven." These words are so simple and still so true. Robert Downey Jr.'s life is a prime example of his words. In an interview with the book New Breed, Robert Downey Jr. said that his father would use drugs as a way to bond with him as a child, because that's all his father knew. He proves this point with a story of his dad smoking a joint with him at only 6 or 7 years old. Although it sounds very strange and toxic, Robert Downey Jr. described it as just an artistic family trying to find normalcy, and marijuana was a staple of the household like rice. But Robert Downey Jr. made it out and developed into an upstanding actor and role model. Due to my research of the actor, I am able to share information about Robert Downey Jr. I will be telling you about his personal life, his career, and his philanthropies. First, I would like to tell you about his personal life. As previously mentioned, Robert Downey Jr.'s childhood was a traumatic and harmful experience, emotionally and physically. His parents both divorced when he was only 13 years old. Divorce is bad enough for a child already, but he also had to deal with the pressure from his parents being both actors and filmmakers. He had a breakout role in a movie called Less Than Zero, where he portrayed a desperate drug addict who spins out of control trying to become sober. The role was quickly proven to be more than Robert Downey Jr. could handle, as his own drug addiction began to worsen and hurt him even more. In an interview with The Guardian, Robert Downey Jr. described his role on this movie as an exaggeration of himself, but he later denies that and says that he became an exaggerated version of this drug addict character. In June of 1996, Robert Downey Jr. was arrested for driving erratically and under the influence of alcohol, but that's not where that charge ends. The cop found black tar heroin, cocaine, and an unregistered handgun in the back of his car. After a strange case called the Goldilocks incident, Robert Downey Jr. was placed into a rehab center, where he escaped, was arrested, and then got put in a rehab center again. After a long time spent in and out of jail and rehab centers, apparently, Robert Downey Jr. decided he was better off without his drugs. Robert Downey Jr. was completely clean for the first time in 2003 in years, and the judge decided he was becoming upstanding enough to completely erase all his charges. From here, his life simply went uphill, leading him to become the amazing actor and influential figure that we all know. Now that I've told you about his busy personal life, I would like to tell you about his career. According to biography.com, which I accessed on November 22nd, Robert Downey Jr. found his career reaching its first high with his Academy Award in the role Chaplin. From here, he worked on several various movies, working his way up through the film, like Natural Born Killers and Richard III. Various different television shows and drug scandals and headlines all brought Robert Downey Jr. to the spotlight. He was given plenty of chances from different news platforms and TV stations, and with each he made a lasting impression. He soon found himself regularly appearing on sketch comedy shows like the Saturday Night Live. His career was on a steady uphill climb, and it only became easier when he got a role as Iron Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This became the peak of his career, and this role became his most popular role. Most people began to view him as a hero, but not only because of his role as Iron Man, but because of the role model he became to people just like him. Now that I've told you about his career, I would like to tell you about his philanthropies. Robert Downey Jr. is one of the highest paid actors out there right now, and he does not let any of it go to waste. According to LookToTheStars.org, which I accessed on November 22nd, he is infamous for donating to 15 different charities, like Clothes Off Our Back and the ALS Association. Above that, he wears an Iron Man mask to multiple Make-A-Wish events and others. Obviously, as previously mentioned, he's an incredible role model to an uncountable amount of people. A lot of people view this man as a real-life superhero. For the last few minutes, I've given you information about Robert Downey Jr. I've told you about Robert Downey Jr.'s personal life, his career, and his philanthropies. As an actor, if you don't already see Robert Downey Jr.'s face everywhere, then perhaps the next time you do, you'll think of what I told you and have a newfound respect for him. And you can find a new understanding for the power that this man holds to break free of his drug addiction that had such a strong control over his life. He has helped thousands of people recover and is a tremendous role model. Remember his words whenever you feel yourself reflecting on your bad past. The lesson is that you can make mistakes and be forgiven.